Climate change has global implications. It's going to affect everything, everywhere. So how do we study climate change? Well, on the east coast of Florida, part of the University of Florida, we are here at Whitney Marine Lab.
My name is Dr. Todd Osborne. I'm from the University of Florida's Whitney Laboratory for Marine Bioscience. And we're out here today in the Matanzas River, and a tributary to that, this is Dolphin Creek, looking at climate change that you can actually see, evidence of climate change. And what I'm showing you here, if you look out across this marsh platform, the vegetation, the grasses that you see are Spartina alterniflora, a common dominant species of vegetation all the way up the east coast from about central Florida to Maine, right? This is the dominant vegetation. South of central Florida and south is mangroves. It's more tropical. And what we're finding here in St. Augustine, which is about almost 100 miles north of their historic range, we're getting mangroves showing up in our salt marsh. And it's not just a fluke. It's not 1 or 2 years. As you can see, these little guys over here in the marsh, the last year or two's growth. These trees that we're looking at here are probably 5 to 6 years old. And the ones in the back there are almost 20 years old. Those are black mangroves. And those trees are intolerant of cold events. And so when we think about climate change, we often think, oh, it's getting hotter. But that's not necessarily the case. In this region, we know that we're having a lower frequency or less frequent freeze events. And because these trees are so susceptible to freezing, that's usually what keeps their northern range down around central Florida. But it's been 23 years since we had a substantial hard freeze, and therefore these trees have been migrating northward. In fact, this used to be the northernmost location for mangroves in the state, but that has been surpassed in the last 5 years or so, and they're all the way up almost to the Georgia border. And what that tells us is that it's a opportunity to visualize what climate change actually looks like. And so for our coastal ecosystems, these marsh environments are very important. All of that material, all of that grass material senesces in the wintertime and creates this organic food for the food web. And it's substantial. The productivity, when we think about productivity of plants, that rivals productivity in tropical rainforest. But when you see the transformation that's occurring, now we're going from a grassy, marsh landscape to a forested one. There's a whole lot of implications there that we're not even sure what that means environmentally. What is that, for the ecosystem and its function? We're researching that right now. But these trees, as they migrate in and kind of take over the marsh platform, they do change the environment. And you can imagine that. It's like looking at a field of grass versus a forest. And that's the dramatic difference visually that we see here in areas that are being kind of invaded, if you will. But this is just plants taking advantage of opportunity. The neat thing about mangroves, and if you look really closely on those trees over there, these are black mangroves, you'll see these lima bean looking, what look like seeds, but they're actually live bearing plants. They produce propagules, which are already sprouted seeds. So germination wise, when they fall off the tree, they've already germinated, and they just need to find a place to wash up and take root. And that's how they're so prolific in spreading. Each one of these trees can produce thousands of propagules. And we have all three major species here. We have the red mangrove, which is kind of iconic. It has the long cigar-shaped propagules and the big prop roots that stick out. And they are kind of red. The prop roots are red. And you can see them. The black mangrove, it's hard to see here, but has its root structures are a little different. They have nematophores and look like these little snorkels sticking up all over the ground. And that's how we identify those readily by looking at the landscape. And then the white mangrove, which you're not seeing any here, is probably the least freeze tolerant or temperature tolerant of the three species in Florida. And those guys are back in the higher elevations. They don't like to be as wet, so we don't see them on the edge of the marsh like we see the black and red mangroves. But we have all three species here. And what that tells us is that our wintertime temperatures are not getting low enough to keep these trees out. And it's not just in Florida. The take-home message here is this is happening all around the world. It's a process ecologists are calling tropicalization, because the temperatures the cold temperatures are not reaching as far south, or in the case of the southern hemisphere, as far north. And so mangrove expansion poleward is happening around the globe, all along the limited extent of those trees. And so it's a very interesting process, one that we can study, but also one that, when there's a lot of folks that aren't sure about climate change, that doubt that that's real, but you can actually see it here. 20 years ago, these trees weren't here. Now, in the history of St. Augustine, there are maps from the 1600s and visual assessments of vegetation that mention them. So we know they come and go, and our climate does cycle. And so this is a great indicator of that. And so we understand that throughout history, these trees may have been here before. But in the last 100 years, it's been hands down dominated by marsh grasses. And so as you kind of take a look around the landscape and you wonder, well, what effect does this have? Is this a bad thing or is it a good thing? The jury's kind of out. On the ecological side of things, they produce organic matter. That organic matter stores carbon. We talk about that all the time. Carbon sequestration is being really important for climate change. So they are what we would call a negative feedback for climate change. As these trees grow, they capture more carbon and therefore limit CO2 in the atmosphere. However, as humans, we're creating CO2 at such a rate that I don't think that's going to have a big effect globally. But the more subtle changes may just be the habitat value. What's the difference between the salt marsh for crabs and wading birds and fish versus a mangrove forest? We know they're both very productive ecologically, but different species utilize them differently. And it's not just the trees that are changing up here. So we see fish species have changed. We're getting more snook. We're getting lionfish in our area, which weren't here before. We also have new species of invertebrates. So one of the most notable is the mangrove tree crab, or the Aratus crab. And they actually live, they're arboreal crabs. They live in the tree themselves. And that's a newcomer here in the last 10 years or so, which has been really interesting. And they're migrating literally ahead of the trees now. They've been seen up in Georgia in places where mangroves have not established yet. But so as these wintertime temperatures fail to freeze back these more tropical species, they are expanding poleward in both directions around the globe.
Hi, I'm Sean Wesley, and I work here at Whitney Marine Lab. And what I have here are mangrove propagules. So we have what we most commonly think of, or rhizophora. These are a red mangrove species, as we saw earlier in the video with Dr. Osborne. We also have a black mangrove species here, which is the Vincinia. And we have a white mangrove species here. This is our third one, Laguna calaria. And we see the difference in propagule. And like we talked earlier, these are viviparous. So that means they are a live birth species. They're a live birthing tree. But we can see the different type of propagule between these three species. So this is our black mangrove propagule. You see it's different than our white mangrove propagule. But these will turn into what we have over here behind us, these tall trees. Something also that's really neat and really fun to see, the difference in salt excretion, right? Because these are salt tolerant species. So we look here, if we zoom in close, we can come in and see that the salt is being excreted and excluded by this black mangrove here. You can see the salt on the leaf. And just like many salt-tolerant species, there's many ways to exclude or excrete salt. So something else we notice here, if I pluck on this leaf here, it's yellow. See how easy these just kind of pluck off or senescing off this tree. That is filled with salt. And so that is one way for this tree to excrete and exclude the salt. Something that a lot of people misconstrued often. These trees are still collecting groundwater. So as we have fresh water rushing through, right, that is still something that these trees are picking up on, even though they are oftentimes very coastal. We think of them as being in the coast. A lot of times we have these black and white species. Sometimes they'll sit more basin. We think of our red mangroves are our big coastal, right? These are oftentimes the big prop roots, like we talked earlier, into the coastal soil and coastal system. But a lot of times we'll see these species back further inland. So they are able to capture and utilize some of that fresh water. Just kind of looking around here, we have a lot of black mangroves and just a couple whites throughout this little stand of mangroves. These red mangroves here, we utilize them, or we think as a scientist, we often think of blue carbon when I discuss these red mangroves or rhizophora, right? These species, they sequester large chunks of carbon, rivaling or oftentimes greater than terrestrial forests and terrestrial ecosystems. So utilizing and using these propagules as restoration pieces and coastal resiliency pieces as climate change increases, and we see this global impact as many societies around the world have noticed the importance of reestablishing these coastal species, not only for their fisheries but also for we think here we just had our hurricane hit. The coastal resiliency that these trees provide as an ecosystem service is second to none. So we're growing propagules here for coastal and for restoration purposes.
Hi, my name is Anna Beard, and I'm a lab manager here at the Whitney Lab for Marine Bioscience in St. Augustine, Florida. And I'm going to talk to you guys briefly today about a really cool project that I do here. And while a lab manager wears many hats, one of the biggest hats that I wear here is I do analytical chemistry in our lab. And we are actually a biogeochemistry lab, and it's like a super fancy way to say that we are looking at elemental cycling in a ecosystem. So we're looking at nitrogen and phosphorus and carbon and how those molecules are actually, these elements are actually cycled through and stored and fluxed into ecosystems, and more particularly our local estuaries here in St. Augustine, Florida. And behind me you will see the Cadillac of chemistry work and benchtop chemistry. This is a discrete analyzer, and I can actually look at nitrogen and phosphorus and see how these elements are playing a role in our local waterways. With climate change at our front door here locally, we are more concerned as scientists about the rate of climate change. And this is something that I love to talk about to people every day. So I've taken all this time in my career to study this topic. And what I see from people who maybe haven't had the chance, please let me share this knowledge with you. I've spent so much time on it. Let me help you out, okay? And so one of the things that we talk about here is while greenhouse gases have already played a role here naturally in our climate and our Earth actually produces greenhouse gases naturally. But humans, we've added a lot to that, and scientists are more concerned at the rate of greenhouse gas accumulation that we are experiencing now. So it leaves scientists asking a question of, we're somewhat in an uncharted territory here now with how greenhouse gases are being put out anthropogenically, which is a word we use for how humans are contributing to this phenomenon. And we like to pay attention to this because climate change can actually affect a lot of things. And to save us all a lot of time today, it actually can affect water temperature, and it can affect how these elements that we're looking at can cycle and be stored and be fluxed in our ecosystems. So nitrogen and phosphorus are actually you could call it a gasoline to a fire, right? So nitrogen and phosphorus are actually how algal cells build their tissue layers. So it's like food for them. So they exist, these things, naturally in water columns and in also different ecosystems. But adding to that can cause these massive blooms that you see here locally in Florida on the west coast and the east coast of Florida State. You've seen these you've seen red tide blooms, you've seen these algal accumulations in our local waterways, on the news, on CNN, making national headlines, not just here in the state of Florida, but worldwide, and also, more importantly, in the United States. How these elements are cycled within our ecosystem is important for us to look at. It can tell us a lot about what's happening in our local waterways and how we can help that, how we can tell people about this, and how we can maybe help change that. So with nitrogen and phosphorus that I was saying before, we pay attention to those due to how algal cells can build their tissue layers off of this. So it's almost like they're food. They exist naturally, just like red tide does in an ecosystem and a waterway. But if you give it all kinds of food to eat, just like me, I'm gonna eat it all, and it'll be good to go. So this is just one of the methods that we use here to help in climate change and to help study in climate change. We also have a TOC. Now this is a Shimadzu. This is a total organic carbon analyzer. We also use this as well to see how carbon is being processed in an environment locally here as well. So you can use a lot of chemistry benchtop methods to help tell a story. And my local research project that I am doing now is actually dealing with climate change and how these warming scenarios are actually changing our ecosystems, and we have to ask these questions: is it for the better or for the worst? So we have a lot of questions, and there's more to come on that one. I'm actually looking at how the black mangrove species are coming into the salt marsh territories, and how our warming environment is changing this ecosystem, and how nutrient storage is being affected or not affected.
Want to learn more about our Lunch with the Scientist program? Make sure to like and subscribe and visit us online at www.headwaterscienceinstitute.org for a full list of our video library and curriculum.